For many 3D artists, creating a fully rendered scene is not an option. This is especially true for real-time applications such as games and simulation. For those artists, the lighting and textures need to be rendered and applied to the geometry as texture maps. This is where the Render to Texture option comes in very handy. Render to Texture provides an interface for rendering the materials applied to geometry as unfolded texture maps that contain lighting, color, and other scene information. Setting up a Render to Texture, like other aspects of 3ds Max, can range from simply rendering the map that contains all the information to rendering separate images that can be used by game engines. From the Quick Access toolbar, click Open. Navigate to the Chapter 4 subdirectory and open the file Chapter 4 rtt01.max. This is a simple interior space that represents the entry and exit point for a theme park ride. Notice the shaded view is using the consistent colors option with no shadows or ambient occlusion. This viewport style will ensure that we're seeing the materials on the objects without the added effects of scene lighting and shadows. We're going to bake the textures for the floor, walls, and ceiling into a single complete map that will then be reapplied to the surfaces. I've created a selection set that makes it easier to select the objects we want to bake. From the Selection Set dropdown, choose RTT Objects. This will select the floor, walls, and ceiling objects. It will make saving the Render to Texture files simpler if we first configure the render output file that saves to the hard drive. Click Render Setup from the main toolbar. Navigate to the Common panel. Scroll down until you see the Render Output area. To save a rendered image automatically to the hard drive, click the Files button to the right of the Save File checkbox. Enter themepark.jpg for the file name and press Enter. In the JPEG Image Control dialog, click OK to accept the image defaults. Since we're not using this version of the rendered image, the image quality is not critical. Close the Render Setup dialog. From the Render menu, choose Render to Texture. This opens the Render to Texture dialog. Let's take a quick look at the dialog and the key areas we'll be interested in. At the top is the General Settings rollout. This contains the output area. The path is the current location that 3ds Max will save the files to that are created when using the Render to Texture tool. To the right of the path is a button that lets you change the location. The default location is the Images directory within the Scene Assets folder. Below that are two options: Skip Existing Files and Render Frame Window. Skip Existing Files will cause 3ds Max not to render files that have already been rendered and saved to the path. Render Frame Window shows the rendering in progress along with a progress bar. The Render Settings area lets you configure the settings you desire for rendering the textures. You can choose from either preset settings or manually configure the settings. Notice that the three objects selected are listed in the objects list. The Objects to Bake rollout lets you set up projection mapping for projecting geometry into the rendered texture. Here you can also set the mapping coordinates and whether you want to use existing coordinates that are already applied to the objects, or if you want 3ds Max to automatically unwrap the objects. We're not going to change anything in this rollout, so we'll keep the default options. Make sure the Output rollout is open. Currently, there are no output maps to render. Click Add to open the Add Texture Elements dialog. From the list, choose Complete Map and click Add Elements. This now populates the output section of the parameters for the complete map. In the selected Element Common Settings area, we're able to change several parameters of the files that will be rendered. We'll leave the default name as the name for this element. Now we want to set a target map slot that will be used when 3ds Max creates a new material for this object. From the drop-down, notice that we only have one option for the rounded corners source map. That's because the map that is currently going to be used only has that map slot available. Before we can select an appropriate map slot, we need to change the type of material that will be created when the render to texture completes. Before we do that, set the map size to 1024 by 1024 by clicking the appropriate button in the map sizes. There is an option to have the map size calculated automatically so that smaller objects are rendered using smaller maps. This saves render time and memory by rendering an appropriate image size. Smaller objects get smaller maps, larger objects get larger maps. In the Selected Elements Unique Settings area, we want to make sure the Shadows option is checked. Other options will appear in this area depending on which element is selected. Open the Baked Material rollout if it's not open. In order to be able to assign the element to an appropriate map slot, we will need to use the Create New Baked Material option under the Save Source Create Shell option. We will leave the default material type to Standard Blinn. This will create a new material called a shell material that will contain both the original material and the new baked material, and allow us to choose which material we want to use. Now we can select a target map slot. In the Selected Element Common Settings area, choose Diffuse Color from the Target Map Slot drop-down. Open the Automatic Mapping rollout. The Automatic Mapping rollout contains options that will specify how the automatic unwrap mapping will function and how 3ds Max will determine the size of automatically sized maps. At the very bottom of the Render to Texture dialog, we have options to render the textures now or only unwrap the objects to be rendered later. We can also decide what material we want to see in the viewport and what we want to use for rendering. For our purposes, we'll keep the defaults. That will show us the baked material in the viewports and still use the high quality material if we decide to use the Scene Render option. With all the parameters set, click Render to begin the process. If you're asked to overwrite a file, go ahead and overwrite it. You'll notice that the render frame window opens, along with a progress bar showing the overall progress and the progress on the current task. Once all the rendering tasks have finished, the viewport will be updated to show the baked materials. As you can see, the lighting and texturing has been rendered into the materials that are now correctly placed on the geometry.